Downtown Rotary. Well, for Rotary Business today, we have some new member introductions. And I get to introduce both of them today. The first one is Andrew. And federal level, and regularly presents about rural broadband and Midco's role in closing the digital divide. Prior to joining Midco, Curley served as Deputy State Director for AFP South Dakota, as well as Southeast Area Director for then Congresswoman Christine Noem. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. He and his wife Amanda live in Sioux Falls with their two children, Genevieve and Cormac. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Curley.
Thank you. It's good to be here. First, I have to say thank you to Tyler Tordson, who was my proposer, who was unfortunately not able to be here today because of the weather. Got stuck out in Rapid City, but Tyler was the one who kind of finally gave me that final nudge to turn in my application, and so I appreciate that. So Tyler, if you're listening, thanks for having me be here. Kind of heard my background, so I won't rehash that, but kind of just mention my interest in joining Downtown Rotary. Given the background I have had the opportunity to attend numerous Downtown Rotary meetings over the years, particularly when they've been focused on political or governmental programming like we've had the last few weeks. And I've always been struck by the degree to which this is truly a group of community leaders interested in making sure we're leaving Sioux Falls better than we found it. And that's kind of where I've been at in my life, in my career, as I raised my family here, interested in making sure that the Sioux Falls I found is better than it has been for my children as I leave it for them. And then also some of the kind of founding principles of this organization really drew me to it as well. And I just look at things like the 4-way test. Just imagine if everyone took that before they posted on social media, how much better of a world we'd be in. But you see a degradation of that over our political discourse these days, and an organization that's dedicated to truth and honesty and respect is something that really drew me to it. So I'm truly excited to be here, and so looking forward to meeting more of you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Andrew. The next to be introduced is one that I'm proposing. Her name is Christina Schaefer. Christina serves as Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Risk Officer for First Bank and Trust. Prior to joining First Bank and Trust, Christina practiced law at Davenport Evans Law Firm in Sioux Falls, where she was a member of the Financial Institutions Practice Group. She graduated from South Dakota State University in Brookings, received her Juris Doctorate from Creighton, and is a certified regulatory compliance manager. Christina is actively engaged in efforts to prevent elder financial exploitation and was appointed to the South Dakota Elder Abuse Task Force. She is a member of several local, state, and national professional organizations, serving on a number of committees and advisory councils. As well as chair-elect of the South Dakota Bankers Association, Schaefer regularly enjoys Girls on the Run, serves on the Helpline Center Board of Directors, and mentors 2 children as part of the Lutheran Social Services school-based mentoring program. In her free time, Schaefer enjoys watching Minnesota Twins baseball, reading, and running. Her family includes her daughters Olivia and Harper and husband Scott. He is originally from Miller, South Dakota. And if I may add to that scripted bio, Christina has also kept me out of trouble for the better part of nearly 15 years. So please join me in welcoming Christina Schaefer.
I don't know if I've been successful in keeping you out of trouble, but I've sure tried. It's really an honor to be here today. I'm very excited about the opportunity to get to know you all in the days and weeks ahead. Just really honored to be here and work with Jason. I work at First Bank and Trust. Many of you are probably familiar with our organization. We're a family-owned bank. We are in 17 communities. We have 22 locations kind of on the eastern side of the state. I'm not going to repeat a lot of what's in my bio, other than I grew up on a farm outside of Miller, South Dakota. So this weather is, I drove 20 miles to town in this weather to school. But it resonates with me why I was excited to join Rotary. And that is my dad would be outside all day. He'd get up early, he'd work in the field all day, and then at night he'd head to town to serve on the school board or the elevator board. My mom was the same way. She was my 4-H leader. She was on the FSA board in town. So I was really fortunate at a very early age to see service above self in action. And so that's something that's resonated with me and one of the reasons why I'm excited to be in Rotary. I've also been excited to watch the work with mentorship that occurs. As Jason mentioned, I've mentored 2 girls through the LSS school-based mentoring program. For a long time, I couldn't make it to Rotary because I mentored on Mondays. But after 10 years together, my mentee just graduated from high school. So now I've got Monday afternoons free. So yes, it's exciting. So, and again, for events like today and the discussion we're about to have. So thank you again for your time today and for listening to me. And I'm excited to be here and meet you all in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Christina, for joining the Downtown Rotary Club. I know without a doubt that you two will be great additions to this club and serve to help advance the work that we are doing. I will now turn it over to Jack Marsh, who has put together a great panel for us today to discuss some very important subjects that are very timely, whether it's good or bad, but timely nonetheless. So, Jack.
Well, thank you, Jason, and welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see everybody here meeting in person. Thank you for being so conscientious about our social distancing protocols, and also welcome to those who are watching this online. My name is Jack Marsh. I've been a member of Sioux Falls Downtown Rotary for more than 25 years. I'm a former president. I'm I'm retired, but I have a full-time volunteer job. I'm the co-founder and co-chair of South Dakota Newswatch, which is an independent nonprofit news organization trying to encourage civil discourse, civic engagement, and a better informed citizenry. Our topic today, our program is titled Looking Ahead, American Democracy at a Crossroads. Certainly a timely, relevant, and critically important discussion for us. An opportunity for us to explore the health of this democracy, what ails it, and ways in which we might be able to strengthen this democracy. When you're invited to be a program chair for a week, and I've done it now, I think this is my 8th week, but when you're invited to be a program chair by Jason or by Tony Knorr, who's our president-elect, you have the great honor of putting together the panel that you want. And so I am so proud of this incredible group of distinguished South Dakotans. And they were handpicked by me for a reason, for their understanding and appreciation for the democratic process, for their intellect, their civility, their integrity, and their decency. They are former South Dakota Governor Dennis Daugaard, retired State Supreme Court Justice Judith Meierhenry, and political scientist, scholar, and author Matthew Moen. Daugaard was elected to 2 terms as South Dakota's 32nd governor, serving from 2011 to 2018. Judith Meierhenry retired from the Supreme Court after serving on the appellate bench from 2002 to 2011, and then previously as a state trial judge from 1988 to 2002. Matthew Moen is former Dean of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Dakota, and moved back to South Dakota this summer after 3 years as CEO. Excuse me. After 3 years as CEO and president of the Gettysburg Foundation in Pennsylvania. Let's start with some context, some historical context, actually. In 1787, the founding fathers met in Philadelphia to draft the U.S. Constitution. And as the story goes, Benjamin Franklin was walking out of Independence Hall after that constitutional convention when someone supposedly shouted, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" To which Franklin, we are told, responded, "A republic if you can keep it." Fast forward to today, that's 233 years. My opening question to each of our distinguished panelists today is to assess the health of this democratic republic. What is it that keeps you awake at night? And what alarm, if any, should be sounded? And I'd like to begin with Governor Daugaard.
Well, first, let me say I was very excited to be invited to this panel because I know these chairs are a lot more comfortable than those chairs. So if I was going to be here, I thought, well, might as well be comfortable. Well, I think there's certainly some decline in the civility of our discourse in political areas and even outside political realm. And it is a concern because certainly if we have disagreements or we have differing ideas about how to find solutions to widely perceived problems, then we need to come to some agreement about what those solutions are. And certainly in a democracy, you need to have a majority agreement on what those solutions are. And if the discourse devolves into personalization and vitriol and name calling, then the likelihood of that agreement certainly declines, and then our problems go unsolved. So it is a problem, and part part of it, I think, stems from the shallow relationship formed these days. There's less depth in the time spent with one another. You have a wider circle of acquaintances with whom you maintain a connection through electronic means primarily. And the depth of your understanding of those others is sometimes not very great. And so we tend to perceive people as two-dimensional and having attitudes that are one way, whether they're correct or not. And so I think back in the old day when Benjamin Franklin went to Washington, it was hard for him to leave and go back home without a long trip. And so oftentimes people, especially in political jobs, would come to the seat of government and they'd stay there for long periods of time. And when the government wasn't actually interacting and meeting and voting or debating, they would be socializing one another and they get to know one another. And then they start to accept the differences as being the difference held by someone who was otherwise a friend. And so that's different today. It's different. So I'll just offer that as a first shot.
Justice Meierhenry?
I have to not agree with him on these chairs, by the way. They're made for tall men. I think my concern that probably keeps me up at night is in order for the democracy to be vibrant and continue, the electorate has to have trust in the institutions. And when you take the three branches of government, I think that there has been a separation for a variety of reasons, but there's less trust in the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branches of government. And some of the things that are going on and the rhetoric that is being used by the people that are running for office or the media, as Governor Daugaard pointed out, doesn't lend itself to create trust in the normal person going to work every day. And so if you start to distrust it and you don't trust your legislators or your congressmen, if you don't trust the governor, if you don't trust that they're using those institutions are being run or developed appropriately, then I think you've got some real concerns. And I think that's a challenge that we all need to think about. Instead of tearing everything down, what things can we agree on to bring that trust back? What do we need to do to rejuvenate that trust? Because if we lose trust in it, whatever branch it might be, or all of the branches of government, then I think we're in danger as a democracy going forward. That's my concern.
Dr. Moen?
Well, it's nice to be with you today. Thanks for having me. What the governor said and what Judith said are exactly right. Human beings are complicated, and we maybe not interrelate as well as we used to, and we don't trust our institutions and maybe one another as much as we used to. The thing that keeps me awake is a little more at the macro level. If any of you are fans of Economist magazine, they've been tracking the march of democracy around the world since 2006. And this is the lowest score cumulatively that the world has ever seen since they started tracking it. And so the United States has been struggling. That's what we're here to talk about. But it's also part of a global enterprise as well, where we see the erosion of democratic principles in some regimes. Democracies can die by being slowly voted out of existence or by military coup. We've seen both of those happen, not so much in what we would consider the first world, but in other parts of the world. And so we're struggling, other places are struggling. And I think one of the things that makes Jack's idea here a good one today is to talk a little bit about the way in which we are struggling and the way in which we try to fix it.
Let's try for some historical context, though. Dr. Moen, you said that Economist Magazine has been tracking this since 2006, and I know there's a great deal of concerns around our country that we are so, I think times are so divisive, but we did come through a civil war over 150 years ago, so there has been a time when we were far more divided. We were killing one another. States were trying to succeed, form a new country. Dr. Moen, you just finished up a time as the CEO of the Gettysburg Foundation, which is based in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. What are some of the lessons from the days of Lincoln, that Civil War? Put these troubled times in perspective against what was going on in this country 150 years ago.
So every day I drove to work, I drove past the cemetery where Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. And we sometimes forget about it. We see the Gettysburg Address as principally a memorial to fallen soldiers, which it is. But it was also a great statement about democracy. Lincoln begins 7 years ago, which is his way of dating the birth of democracy to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. In 1776, I used to tell people, it's just a math problem. Take the Battle of 1863 and subtract 87, 7 years ago, brought the new nation, that's 1776. And then Lincoln famously ends with the democracy, and this is the point relevant to our discussion today. He said, governments of, by, and for the people shouldn't perish from the earth. The message being that they can. And there was a book written a few years ago called How Democracies Die. And typically the way they die is by military coup. Again, not so much in the industrialized world, but more in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. And they get slowly ground down. And they turn their back on their democratic norms. And that is more likely to happen in more, I don't know what the word is, industrialized countries. And so those macro trends are part of what we're dealing with. And then, of course, there's a lot of stuff particular to America.
So how serious is this situation as the three of you see this? I mean, is our democracy truly under threat right now? Or are we just going through a tough time?
Well, I'm going to jump in on that. I guess I'm still optimistic, and I think that one of the things that gives me some hope is the huge turnout that appears to be they're predicting for the election. I think that's one of the things that
50 million Americans have already voted.
Right. Over the years, I've always been dismayed by seeing those numbers go down, and that sometimes, only half of the population even votes. And you have to assume the part that the people that don't vote are just not engaged. They don't understand it. They don't have the time. They don't take the time. So I'm optimistic in that as long as people are engaged and participate in our democracy, I still think we've got, there's some real optimism there. And of course, my other part of my optimism is when I look at these young people that are coming out of high schools and colleges, and they have maybe some different philosophies on climate change and things like that. And I think that they are engaged, and And we'll see how many of them actually vote this time, but they're indicating that they're more engaged this time. And I think that that's good. And we were talking earlier, you know, they came out with like 15% of the population are really political junkies, which we're all sitting here, part of us, and most of you probably. And we follow all this and know who's involved and so on. But the 85% are pretty much going about their lives and they can't tell you that. And so, you know, I think that we forget that those 85% need to be engaged, and I don't know how to get all of them committed to it. But I am optimistic that we're going to see some changes. Usually, out of a tumultuous time like this,
a functioning democracy. It just doesn't. Heart, more optimistic, and of things in general. And so I'm hopeful that part of people's ambivalence to voting, for example, is that their life is good and they're not that worried about about the things that are in the debate in the political world. They don't care one way or another, or they trust that others who are paying more attention will decide for them, and they're satisfied with that. So I don't know that I am as deeply concerned about this being a critical time or a crisis. I think our democracy can work and does work. So we'll see in this next election. Every couple of years we have an election. Every 4 years we have a big election, and then the world changes. So I'm hopeful.
Matt Moen, this is your field of study. You're a scholar when it comes to political science and to the democratic system. The optimism of Justice Meierhenry and Governor Daugaard?
Yeah, I actually do. My point in framing it the way I did was not that I'm gloomy about our prospect, but just that there's difficult times around the world affecting democracies generally. But there's an incredible resilience. You know, one of my favorite stories, if I can just take a sec, is in Montpelier, Virginia, James Madison sat down prior to the Constitutional Convention that Jack mentioned in 1787. And if you've ever been to Montpelier, been in Madison's house, he sat at a desk overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. And he spoke 5, maybe 6, possibly 7 languages. And he was surrounded by hundreds of books sent by Jefferson, his friend, from Paris, about the fall and the rise of regimes throughout world history. And he sat at that desk and he crafted a constitution. And he crafted a remarkable instrument that has survived for these hundreds of years now plus, in a way that fragmented and pluralized political power, separated power, checked and balanced power, made government move slowly so consensus could be built, often moderated opinion, provided for the kind of rapid change in difficult situations that Justice Meierhenry just mentioned. And so when you take all of that, the first great American democratic experiment, which we are the beneficiaries of, is a resounding success. Never in the history of the world has there been a more prosperous and free country. I guess my thing is that I think we have to have a seriousness of effort to build a second great democratic experiment that is going to need to be maybe a little bit different, certainly more inclusive as America is changing. And that's the challenge before us. And where I have a lot of unbridled optimism is exactly where Judith Meierhenry was. When I look at the rising generations, I see great hope in how they think and how they relate. And so I'm not a pessimist about it. I'm not a cranky baby boomer. Well, I'm a cranky baby boomer, but I'm not a cranky one about younger generation. I think that their day in the sun can make this country just as robust or more than ever.
Do we have a related or even greater issue with our fractured society? We have cries over injustice. We have demands for law and order. We have certainly great racial and class divide in this country right now. Maybe it boils down to this question. Has America lost its moral compass?
I'll weigh in on that. I don't think so. I do think it's so important for leaders to be articulate and compassionate, and the clarity of their communication is so important to helping avoid division and instead create compassion and understanding among those who of the haves and the have-nots and minorities and majorities. If you don't have leadership that has clarity of communication and demonstrable compassion, then the opportunity for extreme statements and extreme behaviors is enhanced. And that creates violence, it creates all kinds of bad things.
Is there a lack of compassion and empathy in this country right now, Justice Meierhenry?
I think in certain segments, but to follow through with that, I think that the articulation of, or the being articulate of the leaders has, and I don't know how to say this exactly, but my concern is that we've never had a time in history where we've had the media 24/7 magnify everything that's said and feed it because it's entertainment, not news.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like watching people cage fight. Why would you do that? But yet you're driven to it because they're fighting. And it's an entertainment deal rather than really, you have to dig sometimes to find a piece of a coverage of something that's happening that you can have confidence that you're getting the facts of, rather than making it into something that is entertaining or is even false. And I think that's been a challenge that we have maybe not had as much before. I grew up and we had one channel on TV in South Dakota, but you listened to the news and everybody listened to the 6 o'clock news. You got the same message and you had confidence that you were getting a relatively clear report of the news and what's going on. Now you have to struggle almost to find that.
Yeah.
And then I just read that, it's divided by political parties and so forth. They just listen to one channel that may or may not be giving them the facts, or the other channel that might be giving them the facts, and then of course all of the online media that goes on. So that's the part that I don't know how we're going to get beyond that. I don't know how the electorate can figure out where do you get the truth here,
Right.
because it's sort of an echo chamber. If this is how I feel, then I want to listen to only what feeds what I've already think should be, whether it's a conspiracy theory or what.
Yeah, and,
Which,
and
yeah,
then the social media has algorithms that identify my attitudes and feed me back reinforcement of that attitude. And so then I start to think, wow, everyone agrees with me. My belief is clearly the right belief.
Dr. Moen, I think you call that self-selection of content, right? You're consuming what you want to believe or what you do believe, and not being open to a more comprehensive and reliable news and information.
Yeah, I mean, I would associate myself with Judith's remarks there, which is we've never had such a noisy political environment. It's very hard. It's exhausting. And then to go back kind of to your initial question, Jack, what keeps me up at night is I worry a little bit that there aren't going to be as many Denny Daugaards in the future who are people of integrity who want to run for public office. It's like, who wants to subject themselves to those voices and to that anger and to getting their heads plunked on, cartoons and memes, and maybe even now risk being kidnapped. And so that's something that I think we have to think about as a society, is how do we make public service attractive when, just as somebody who never has been, it doesn't look like a very attractive path.
Governor Daugaard, thoughts on that?
Well, I think one thing that it just occurred to me, one thing I am disappointed by some political leaders who seem to be more attention-seeking than leading. And in some ways, the attention-seeking can help provide political capital so you can achieve political goals that are good and that help your state or country or city. But you do see in some folks, they are excited by the idea of being interviewed by this or that media source, and they like the attention, and it makes me wonder, well, how does that help your city, or how does that help your country, or how does that help your school district, whatever it is? And I think that also contributes to mistrust of political leaders, because you see them as wanting the spotlight rather than keeping their head down and doing the work. And so that's a worry.
Justice Meierhenry, how do we attract people of integrity to pursue public service, to run for public office?
I think we have to encourage them and support them. Those of us who have maybe been there and been involved in it. I share the concern, and I encourage young people. In fact, I just spent Friday talking to the senior class, or the class that graduated from law school at USD, and that was one of the things I challenged them all, that they have that responsibility to give back. And I would say that of all the young people, you have to give back to make society better and leave it a better place than what you were. And when you have the privilege of being educated, you are leaders. And of course, they graduate with very a high level of expectations of ethics. I mean, they have to, otherwise they couldn't be sworn in and continue to practice law. But that's true of other professions as well, and other business leaders, that it's important that when these young people go to work for you as business people, that you encourage them to do that. And I think we see that at the local level. And I guess that gives me hope as well. I think, all politics is local, they used to say. And I think when you look locally, there are young people getting involved. And I think that as a community, we have more trust and faith in our local governments and entities and so forth. So I think it's got to start there. And once they run for the school board or do something that's a civic responsibility that they get involved in, I think once you get involved in it, it kind of gets in your blood.
Mhm.
And then if you gradually learn how to kind of roll with the criticism, and you just have to build up a pretty thick skin, or as Justice Ginsburg said, what, you just become a little deaf?
Yeah. That's right.
So, so are you saying that the dysfunction that we're seeing on a national level doesn't necessarily, we don't see that, we're not seeing that in South Dakota, we're not seeing that locally or in the state legislature for that matter? Is that, you think we are an exception to what's going on nationally?
Well, I'll weigh in. I don't think we're an exception. I think to the extent that Justice Meierhenry was talking about people being unwilling to run because of the kind of behavior of others against them or toward them, and the vilification they endure. You know, Tony Van Huysen is in the audience. He and I have called countless people to try and get them to run for office, and it's a very small percentage that agree. When you identify people and you know people that are intellectually up to it, and they have the character and the moral grounds, and you think this would be a great person, and they're unwilling. They won't do it. I don't know if it's fear of losing, or don't want to spend the time, or they see people get vilified, and they think everyone with whom I'll associate is distasteful to associate with because they are politicians. I mean, the connotations to the word politician now are negative. And in fact, I don't even use that word when I talk about it. I use elected official, and even that's not so good. So it's hard to get people to run. And so that's why I think Justice Meierhenry is right. We need to, all of us, we need to urge people to start getting involved. Most people don't run of their own volition. It's not initiated within. Most people run because they are asked by someone to run. That's how I got involved. I was called on the phone and said, "Hey, why
Who
don't you
issued
run?"
that invitation?
What? Who? Bill Peterson and oh gosh, the former CEO of Business Aviation, Dale Froelich.
Froelich.
Yeah, those two guys called me up and said, "Hey, you should run for the legislature." And then, as Justice Meierhenry said, once you start, then you start learning the ropes a little bit, and then it doesn't seem so intimidating to run for lieutenant governor or then to run for governor. You feel like, well, I know what this is about a little bit, rather than I don't know anything about this.
We'd like to get you involved in this conversation. Questions from Rotarians only, please, but just come right to this microphone. We take one at a time. So if anybody has any question they'd like to put to the panel, please step forward at any time and we'll call on you. Woody, come on forward.
Well, one of the.
Can you identify yourself, Woody?
Oh, yes, I'm Ray Woodson, or better known as Woody. Been a member of Rotary here for about 32 years or so. But anyway, one of my big concerns from listening to my children and other young people at times is how do we get them to even watch the news? Because most of them get their news maybe from Facebook or out on the web that way, and not from, I won't say that all news sources are legitimate, but the basic information that comes from that, and how do we get them involved in that process? And is that important?
Anybody?
I have no idea, because I don't know exactly where they all get their news, but I have 7 grandchildren, and they're senior in high school to their into their 20s, and they are up on the news. I don't know where they all get it, because I don't read newspapers necessarily. Maybe read them online, but they seem to they seem to get the news. They're all involved, I guess, and interested enough that they get it from some source, and I'm not sure where they get it. I guess the news people would know more.
Well, right now, more Americans get their news through social media than through mainstream media. That's the,
Mhm.
that's
And we're not going back, right?
well, I think we should go back to some sanity in this situation, and that is, I think it's so important that people understand the source and the sources that can be trusted. I think there's still a lot of great journalism out there available, and I wouldn't necessarily rely on Facebook or Twitter or any other social media platform for reliable, truthful information.
I think one thing that drives the means by which younger people get their news is whether or not it's free. I think the years of subscribing to paper journalism or other kinds of pay for the news approaches, I think those are gone. And I think the news media that adapts to that and recognizes that, they will be more successful. So, whether it's the Argus Leader feeding a few stories online to try and attract me to their website, and then maybe they get their revenue through advertisement, I don't think they'll get that many subscribers. Now, I just subscribe to some. I subscribe to The Economist, and that because that's so in-depth, but
I think there are many publications, many newspapers now that they have more digital subscribers than print subscribers.
Mhm.
I don't know the situation with the Argus Leader or the other major newspapers in South Dakota, but that's a national trend, certainly.
Speaking of social media, we have a question from social media.
Okay.
Don Olmsted, Rotarian, watching online, wanted you guys to talk about term limits and campaign finance, how you feel those two things are affecting democracy.
Very good. So let's start with campaign financing. The Citizens United case, I think, had vast ramifications. Is it corrupting, Dr. Moen, the amount of money that's being poured into political campaigns around the country?
I don't know, but the question is a good one. And here's my take on it in the larger context of what I said earlier, which is I think part of what we need to do as we have a seriousness and earnestness about, okay, how do we make this better? How do we reinvigorate this? How do we make sure we stay on track? Is to think about whether or not policy changes would help. One of the books I wrote was a book that actually concluded that term limits at the state legislative level were not a good idea based on my experience in Maine. And congressional term limits would require a constitutional amendment because the Supreme Court struck that down a long time ago. But that might then be a question now. To me, that's a question. If, in fact, we're getting people attracted to public life who are attracted by the boxing match component of it, rather than the problem-solving and leadership component about it, should we, in fact, then force them out more regularly and have new people, because institutions change when you change the people more than the people change their views as they are embedded in institutions. So I think that's a legitimate question. I've thought a little bit about campaign finance too. I'm no expert on campaign finance. I taught things like American political thought in Congress and the presidency. But when I think about something like campaign finance, I think, would that be an incentive if we actually went to public financing of elections, which I was never a huge fan of? Would that incentivize people of high quality to run for office by taking that part away? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not suggesting that's the right answer, but I wish it was to me that policy fixes have to be part of the solution here, that we can't simply wait around for better manners, because we're not seeing that. And so, experiment. And then if it doesn't work, change it. I mean, it doesn't have to be, a life or death struggle.
I'm going to jump in a little bit on term limits, and I'm going to talk about what's been going on right now with the U.S. Supreme Court, because they are appointed for they're appointed for life. And there is, and following with Matt's discussion, I think that is a discussion that maybe should be serious at this point on whether or not they should be appointed for life. Maybe it should be for a term. And then, because it does bother me that the courts have been sucked in totally to this political rancor that's going on right now. And my concern with the courts is if you lose, if the courts do not have any power to enforce their decisions or their opinions. And it's the people trust them and follow them because of the goodwill, and that because we believe that that's the final arbiter of sometimes some of the cases, and you go to the courts, they make the decision, and then everybody agrees that we live by those decisions. That's kind of being eroded, and there's so much right now about the politics of it and how this has been ramrodded through, and I'm afraid that in the long run, the way this has been done, and has been done in the last couple years, is eroding our confidence that the courts can be fair and impartial. And I do have some concerns about that. But along with that, maybe that's the discussion. Maybe that takes it more out of the realm of politics, and then people aren't, it won't be quite as political as it has become in the last few years.
And what about term limits for members of the House and the Senate?
I've never been a fan of term limits otherwise, I guess, but I've always thought if you really weren't satisfied, you should vote them out. I think that the state, when we passed that, it hasn't really improved anything, or hasn't. I don't know what the reason was initially, but I don't know if the objective of term limits has actually been realized. But I think with the courts, it's a little different because they're not up for election all the time, and they may not be ever up for election like the U.S. Supreme Court.
Governor Daugaard, what are the lessons in South Dakota from our term limits? Have they worked out as we intended?
No, I don't think so. I know that some in the room will probably remember the term limits wave or movement began state by state. There was a national movement that went from state to state, primarily in states that initiated measures. And it was promoted primarily as a means to check the National Congress. And there was a promotion of people dissatisfied with the National Congress and the National Senate. And so we need to put in term limits. And so if you go to the South Dakota's Constitution today, you'll see that the actual language of the term limits amendment to the South Dakota Constitution included the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress. And then it was only after it passed many states, as well as the local officials, state legislature and so on, it was only after it passed a number of states that it finally made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, who said, no, a state constitution can't change the rules by which a federal U.S. senator and U.S. congressperson are allowed to serve. And so even though the language is still in our state constitution, it's been struck down, that part. And so it was only the state officials whose term limits were affected by the constitutional amendment. And I do agree, in the legislature, I think it's led to aggressive efforts to move up into leadership, which has damaged the collegiality of the body. Because if you're going to be in, let's say, the South Dakota Senate for 8 years only, then very, very soon after you take office, you have to move to start aiming for one of those leadership posts. And I think people perceive, well, if I'm in leadership, then I'm going to have more influence, and probably do have more influence over the political process and what gets passed and what doesn't. Now, would that happen anyway? Maybe I just was oblivious to that kind of activity occurring. But what I saw when I first came into office as a state legislator, term limits had been passed, but they had not yet affected the body. Because I came into office in 1997 was the first year, and term limits didn't take effect until the year 2000. And so there were people who were serving, who had served for 20 years and now could serve 8 years more, but only 8 years more. And there were people who had served 4 years and could serve 8 years more. So you had a body that had a lot of seniority and a lot of experience. And I think in part, some of those in the body had tried for leadership unsuccessfully and then had settled upon and had resolved to themselves, I'm going to be satisfied with my lot. I'm not going to be competing and fighting with my peers to be the next leader. And I'm just going to get along and work toward policy with my elected leaders. So you saw leaders like Mike Rounds was the Senate Majority Leader in South Dakota for 6 years in a row. And why did he keep that position over people who had been there longer? Because he was doing a good job. And people saw him as good at moderating the debate within the caucus and within the body. So I do agree that term limits have not been good. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think they've not been good.
Constitutional officers, though, have always had some kind of limitation. Governor. And,
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we started the, go ahead.
I was intrigued by Governor Daugaard's comment before about you and Tony and others reaching out to folks and asking them to run for the legislature, centering on South Dakota specifically for this. In South Dakota, what are your thoughts on some of the challenges that exist to get some of those younger leaders to be willing to run for office in the legislature, getting past maybe some of the just having to deal with criticism, but more, it's a challenge, I suspect, for young people with families, moving up in their careers, trying to practicing law in a firm or practicing accounting during tax season or something like that. Some of these institutions that have these various expectations from a workforce obligation, people to get somebody to take off a few months of their time, get paid not much, and some of these other sacrifices they have to make people to do that and still carry on with their daily lives.
Good question.
Dr. Moen, you want to take that?
No, I don't, Jack, because I've only been back in the state for 3 months, so pass.
Well, I think you hit it. That's a real issue, because if how do you finance it yourself by taking off of your career, in the middle of your career, at the beginning of your career, to go to peer for that long? Because you work on the weekends, I guess, or whatever, and you're hoping that if you're working for someone else, that they give you that opportunity, which does limit then who can do it and who can't. I don't know. That is a dilemma, and it's probably something that should be discussed, and to see how we can make sure that we have good people that have the ability to run.
Yeah, I do. No question about it. Those limitations are spot on. You can't attract someone who's trying to raise their family and has a busy job, and to convince them they can take away 4 or 5 days a week and go to peer for 8 weeks in a row or so. It's hard to find people that will say, yeah, I can juggle that, make it work. And then you put on top of it, gee, if I don't know where am I going to get the money to run, I don't want to be embarrassed by losing. And then it makes it all that much harder. We had trouble even, but beyond that, there were times when we had trouble finding good people to appoint. When a legislator had to resign midterm for one reason or another, or died midterm, then the money is not an issue. The risk of loss is not an issue. It's just a matter of the juggling part. And you would find people who were willing to self-nominate or who would be nominated by others, but many of them who were nominated by others would say, I can't. And part of it's financial. I mean, here's a good example. Just recently, the South Dakota Supreme Court gave an advisory opinion saying that these COVID-19 funds that are available to help struggling businesses, if I'm a legislator and I have a struggling business, I'm not eligible because I just voted for the appropriation or for the resolution that steered money toward small businesses, and I have a small business. So the Constitution in South Dakota said, no, pretty clearly, you may not benefit from any appropriation that you have any involvement in. And that's good, black and white rule, but it certainly adds to the financial burden that a legislator or others would see if they serve.
Ron, we'll give you the last question.
Thanks. Ron Nelson. Adding to the challenges of recruiting, I got a letter, a fundraising letter from someone in politics. It wasn't for the legislature, but I would think the point might be the same. I've been on boards and things like that. I've always been assured that I don't have any personal liability. This particular fundraising letter talked about this person who was in office before, had been receiving some pot shots for some of their activity that they'd done, and got to an investigation. They had to defend themselves, and they had to pay like $15,000 out of their own pockets on a personal level defending themselves. And I thought, goodness sakes, who, on top of every other challenge that you get in trying to recruit people, who in their right mind would do something like that? Again, I don't know if that pertains to the legislature, but if it's something that is worthy of being on the same or similar topic.
Any thoughts on that? Well, let me close with one final question then, and that is, what is the impact of the presidential election and the Senate contests as well as the U.S. House contest? What's the impact of that outcome, whether it's Donald Trump being reelected or Vice President Biden being elected? Is the path forward going to be any less tough for this country? You can't pass on that one, Dr. Moen.
Yeah, I got lucky last time. Well, I mean, there's enormous consequences of it because they would take us in different directions. If the broader sweep of history is such that democracy is challenged globally for whatever reasons, one election cycle probably doesn't make a difference, 2 or 3 might not. But I guess to try to interconnect the two questions that were just asked back to back and then your all observations, I think one of the things that we need to do in terms of our seriousness and earnestness in getting back to what feels like a more comfortable place is to get refocused on policy decisions that can improve people's lives and solve problems, and take a little bit of the entertainment part of it out of this. And I connected to the previous questions because it seemed to me that was part of the incentive. As I talked to state legislators in Maine, I'm mostly a South Dakotan, but I lived 16 years in Maine and wrote a book on term limits in Maine, which is the first state to have term limits kick in both chambers. And when I spent time in Augusta talking to legislators, it was their sense of collective solidarity of solving problems that made them eat a lot of the other stuff. The being name called or criticized or being called, politician and all those things. And somehow or another, we seem to have kind of lost a little bit of that focus. And so my message, I guess my last comment, my message, I went around the country as president of the Gettysburg Foundation. I traveled 28,000 miles. I made more than 40 appearances in 13 states and abroad, talking about civility and democracy in American public life. And my message often was that it's all fixable. It's all within our power to fix. A lot of it, I think, is on us, people my age. It's our generation that has kind of got us in this tough spot. It's not the younger ones. They're inheriting it. We seem to be a little unwilling to declaw, to let them in on it. And I think that if we could think more inclusively about what a new sort of spirit of democracy is all about, and with a seriousness of purpose that we seem to have lacked as we've devolved into the entertainment and the insult business, I think we'll be well served. And ultimately, like my counterparts on the panel today, and I hope all of you, I remain relentlessly optimistic that the American experiment can come through this. For heaven's sakes, it's not like it was at Gettysburg where we were shooting each other, 50,000 people in 3 days. So we just got to get about it. We just got to get about it with a happy attitude and go try to fix it. So,
Justice Meierhenry?
I don't know if I can top that.
No.
I think it is. I think it isn't going to magically change once the election is over. But I think I'm hoping that the fatigue, we really are fatigued on this, and that maybe, at some point you just say, we need to get along. We need to find those things that we can agree on and focus on those things that we can improve and that we all have a common belief in, and go forward. And I still, it's going to take a while. Obviously, it took us a long while to get here, but I have hope too. And I think, Matt, you're right. We're all responsible. I mean, we kind of got him into this, not me, but your generation. But, we need to be there to help them to get out, but we can't lead it. I think the leadership has to come with a younger generation.
Governor Daugaard, we're going to give you the final word.
Okay, well, I do think that every time you have an election, it reminds us all that our democracy does work in the sense that we choose those who represent us. And it gives everyone a renewed hope that this new elected group will find solutions to some of the problems. And over the years, that has overall occurred. And as Dr. Moen said earlier, one of the intentional designs in our democracy is that things don't move with blazing speed. We want things to move carefully and more slowly, and so there are checks and balances so that occurs. I firmly believe that if there is a crisis, we act. We do act, and with pretty good speed. And now there has to be a collective agreement that it is critical. But once that mass is achieved, then I think we do move. And so I'm hopeful, and certainly the next election will be important, like many are, and we'll see where it goes. But I'm optimistic that things will go well, and ultimately.
We thank you for your thoughtfulness. We thank you for your example. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Dennis Daugaard, Judith Meierhenry, and Matthew Moen.
Jack, thank you for facilitating today. Governor Daugaard, Judge Meierhenry, Dean Moen, thank you for not only bringing your intellect today, but your just darn good example of public service and civility. Thank you very much. Fellow Rotarians and guests, please join us next week where we'll have another great conversation. If you are not able to make it to meetings, please don't hesitate to turn into our Facebook website or YouTube channel. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.